not like the church is coming in and trying to get an exception that all the other churches they have to follow these rules, and then the church is saying no, we don't have to follow these rules. It's just the church is doing the normal process if you always apply for a variance, because there is no such thing as religious building zoning.
When it comes to Nemo's third point, architecture is secondary to the ordinances that happen inside. The church has never denied this point. They've only argued that it's irrelevant legally when it comes to whether a steeple should fall under the protection of RLUIPA and other state laws.
Is reducing the size of a temple, keeping the steeple, but reducing it to 68 feet, does that really cause even a burden, but a substantial burden on religious worship? Does it take anything away from the temple functioning as the house of the Lord? It can still have the steeple. It can still...
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I have another illustrious panel joining me today. This is the second I have in a week. I'm joined by Steven Pynakker, my friend Gustavo Hernandez, Jacob Mayberry, Spencer Lercher. Is that right?
Yeah, I got it.
We're waiting on Luke Hanson from Word Radio. He'll probably pop in a few minutes. But I did a panel a few days ago with Mormonish, Nemo, Jim Bennett, Anthony Miller, and we sort of were diving in and discussing the church looking to build a temple in Fairview, Texas. We talked about the background, the timeline, what's going on. We talked about what the church, its lawyers, and sort of what members are arguing for a temple of 173 feet, now reduced to 158 feet, and then what the town council and the mayor have to say, and the local residents. And there were some critiques from that episode. I did choose that panel because I thought Nemo and Mormonish had a very good understanding, have been following very carefully what was going on. I think they did have good understanding of the timeline, the background, and had good insights. But there's a lot of criticisms that, one, I was promoting sort of prominent critical podcasters, which I think it's not a bad thing to always engage and hear the other side. But then I think the other issue was all of us sort of had the same sort of agreement or came to the same conclusion, so it wasn't maybe super balanced. Whereas this time we have, all of us are Latter-day Saints except for Steve, and I think there's going to be more of a balance of views and argument, so we might be able to challenge each other and maybe share different perspectives that we didn't have in the first panel. So I think this will be really fun. Before we dive into the meat of the discussion, why don't we go around everybody and in about 30 seconds, just say who you are, quick bio, and if you have a platform and a channel, you can share what that is. Steve, will we start with you?
Well, okay. Well, thanks, Murph. Of course, I've been on your channel a few times. You've been on mine a few times. And I started my YouTube channel a little over 3 years ago called Mormon Book Reviews and didn't know a single Latter-day Saint. And this channel that I have, many of you probably are aware of it, but we've been very influential in the scholarly community. We've broken major news stories in the Mormon world, including the sale of the Kirtland Temple was broken on my channel. So we've had a real major impact on the discussion in the Mormon studies world as well. So I'm an evangelical Christian who was an atheist for a long time as well. So it's part of my story. Mormonism is part of the journey of my life. And who else could go on Mormon Stories with John DeLynn and have an episode called How Mormonism Saved an Evangelical's Life? I think that pretty much sums up everything.
Yeah, that was a unique episode. And your channel is a great channel. And you're an important voice in this space as well. Very fair-minded as well. I think you'll have some important insights to share on this. Gustavo, will we go to you next?
Sure. Well, I'm Gustavo Hernandez. I'm from Mexico, and I have a YouTube channel I started over a year ago. It's called Faith Journeys, well, in Spanish, Viajes de Fe. And thank you for the invitation, Murph.
No problem.
I've been aware of the Fairview Texas temple situation for a while now, and I'm not incredibly familiar with law, so I might be like Tony Stark in the Avenger movies. Like, since when did you become an expert in laws? Last night. But happy to be here.
It's great to have you. And your channel, Viajes de Fe, you've had me on. You've had lots of really good scholars and apologists. Steve, you've been on as well, so it's a great channel. I'll put in the description. Jacob, we'll go to you next.
My name is Jacob Mayberry. I co-host a YouTube channel called Actual Mormons with Bridger Coburn. It only has like 400 followers, so we're pretty new. but it's mainly we just respond to critics of the church. We're pretty up and starting. And I'm a corrections officer here in the state of Utah. That's a prison guard, for those who don't know. And it's somewhat relevant to RLUIPA, because RLUIPA doesn't just cover land use. It also covers the religious rights of inmates in prison. Right. And I have received trainings on the religious rights of inmates, which is relevant to RLUIPA. I'm not an expert by any means, and I'm kind of going off the top of my head based on the trainings I've received. And so hopefully I won't butcher it, but I'm also going off of what I've read based off of the legal paper that the church sent to Fairview. So hopefully I'm somewhat informed, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. I like the episode you did. You were ranking apologists, and I was just chuffed that I made it onto A tier. So I was happy about it, despite Bridger's critiques of my production style and use of slides.
Yeah, that didn't come from me.
Spencer, introduce yourself.
My name is Spencer Lercher. I'm the hack on this panel because I don't have a platform. I'm just a nerd that's been following this case pretty closely. So I've watched both hearings in Fairview. I've been following it on Mormonish pretty closely and Mormon stores. I didn't realize there are other platforms covering it, which is great. And I've heard Steve before, and I kind of shocked a few minutes ago that he's been on here. Interested. I've seen him a couple times, and it's been good. But I like the Murph because he provides a platform where, especially in these days, are so polarizing, where he can have people from different perspectives engage in a thoughtful conversation. I think that's what's been missing overall in our society. So I think you do great service for
thank you,
our community.
And this is certainly a polarizing topic. There's certainly a lot of division in the town of Fairview itself, and division between, I wouldn't even say just members and former members, but even amongst members of the church. We seem to be quite divided on this issue. And in the last panel, nobody is opposed to the church building a temple. That doesn't seem to be the issue. And certainly with us, we're also either believers, or Steve, you're really friendly to the Latter-day Saints. None of us are against a temple being built. It's more, should the temple adhere to the town's local zoning codes and regulations, or do they have a religious right under RLUIPA and the First Amendment to supersede, basically? And is this an infringement on like their religious exercise of their religious freedom? So I'm just going to give a basic summary of what's been going on, and then we'll kind of just dive in to the main discussion. So the temple that the church is proposing in Fairview, Texas, it was originally to be 173 feet tall with a 109-foot steeple. It was declined by the zoning and planning, and then it went to the town council. The church asked for a 2-month continuance to adjust their proposal in line with the town zoning. And the town said that they would approve a 68-foot size temple, including the steeple, the temple size being 42 feet, steeple 68 feet, because it's a residential zone, and the height restriction for residential properties is 35 feet. But churches and religious buildings, they get an exemption. It's called a conditional use permit. And the church reduced its proposal to 158 feet with a 65-foot temple building. Approximately, is it 44,000 square feet? I never remember the square feet. I think it's about that. Yeah, sounds about right.
Correct.
And basically, there was a long 5-hour town council meeting. You had the church lawyer speak, you had the mayor speak, and then you had either Fairview residents who were kind of opposed to the temple, and then you had believing Latter-day Saints either from Fairview or other locations in favor for the temple. And what the result was, it was denied without prejudice at the Fairview Town Council meeting, which means they can come back with an adjusted plan. They might consider it, but their plan was rejected, and likely a lawsuit might be filed, and this could go to the Supreme Court. So basically, the church is saying this is religious persecution. We have this federal right under First Amendment rights. This is infringing upon our exercise of religion and RLUIPA, and adjusting the size of the temple is this burden, substantial burden against our worship. Whereas the town is saying, look, you can have a temple, you can even have a steeple. It's in our residential zone. We're given this exemption, but it needs to fit with our zoning codes. It's too big for the community. It's a rural, small country town, and we want it to be happy for the community as well. And I think me and the last panel sort of felt that a compromise could be had, and a 68-foot size temple would suffice. Any quick reactions to our panel? Any critiques you want to give? And then we'll dive in basically to the crux of the discussion.
Dude, would you agree that Steven was going to go first?
Well, before we get to Steve, was there any quick reactions to the panel before we get to the meat of the discussion?
Oh, well, in my case, I could hop on. I've been sort of following the case, not a lot, but the panel discussion was pretty similar to what has been talked about in the Mormonish channel. I also listened to Jim Bennett's and Ian Wilkes Inside Out episode with Mormonish too. So the panel itself was pretty similar with the arguments presented in those different episodes. My reaction to it, I even put a comment on it, is that I tend to mostly agree. I have to say that I think it was a fair conversation. Of course, because we're Latter-day Saints, I guess that I sort of don't like a lot when it feels like other people have to sort of do us a favor and talk about things that we're not willing to talk about or things like that. So maybe that essence, maybe I wasn't a fan of, but I tend to mostly agree.
Right. Well, Steve, I think maybe we could start with, because you had some thoughts that you wanted to share about like the government and state's involvement in religious buildings and religious worship. What would you like to say to begin?
You know, and I actually contacted you. You know, we chatted a little bit. You know, after you did the discussion, and I feel like I look at it this way. I'm actually going to speak in broader terms rather than the specifics of this case, because I want to just kind of talk about what this country was founded on, was on religious liberty. And many people were fleeing Europe because of they were persecuted for their beliefs. Historically, within Western Christianity, the largest building in any community was a church, a cathedral. They were the centerpiece of the community. That is what our Western Christian society is based on, is the idea that Christianity plays a major role. Now, this did not change in the United States. It basically said, the government said, we are not going to establish a state church. Now, keep in mind that the state of Massachusetts had a state church until 1844. So it was not unconstitutional for states to actually have churches. People don't realize that. So the thing is that I look at it as we had a compact with the people, with the colonies, and we had a Bill of Rights. So your right to worship will not be infringed upon. The government will not dictate to religious institutions how they are to worship and how to do church. And I don't think it's the government's role to go and say, well, you didn't have a steeple on this building, so therefore you really don't need steeples. Look, theology can change, religion can change, and say, you know, steeples are an integral part of our church, and it's not the government's role to be the referee to decide what's spiritual, you know, what's religiously correct or not. So I take a very strong position when it comes to our First Amendment and our Bill of Rights in general, which is the government needs to stay out of the affairs of the churches. I do believe that obviously there should be some, but I'm a libertarian, so I don't like councils and bodies and all these people telling people how to live their lives, right? And I don't think that it's appropriate for these governmental agencies to be able to dictate to a church their sacred space. Now, there's a lot of different, you know, I understand, but again, religion in this country has a privileged position over residential rules, over corporate laws. Religion has always been given a special space in this country, and I'm very, very concerned that we are living in a society that's becoming increasingly secular, and as a result, they're using the state to attack religious institutions. And I just firmly believe that we can't allow that to happen. Because why? Because I don't want us to become like Europe. I'm sorry. Sorry, Murph. I don't want us to become like Europe. I don't want us to become a secular society that's become almost nihilistic in many cases, because guess what? Europe has a lot of other problems as a result of them turning their backs on their Christian heritage, and I think it's rather obvious to us how damaging it can be to a society that becomes secular. And again, I was somebody who was an atheist for 13 years, and I'm not an anti-atheist. I call myself a pro-atheist evangelical, and so I've had many prominent atheists on my program. I also want to circle back and also talk about the people on the panel discussion. All of them are friends. Nemo, I had a conversation with a few years ago on Zoom, but I've never just had. Nemo's the one I know the least. But I just want to say that this is not an attack on them. They've all been on my program. They're all good friends. Rebecca Biblioteca is somebody that's been with me almost from the beginning, and actually I helped kind of launch her career, and she was one of my original co-hosts. And so I know that she does her homework and she does really good work. So this is, again, I'm not slamming that panel. I'm just trying to make a statement in favor of religious institutions having special privileges in this society, because that's what we were founded upon as a nation, that wasn't going to pick and choose winners and losers when it came to religion, and that we're going to give a large leeway to religious institutions. And I'll finish with two more points. A lot of people like to think that, oh, well, they have these tax exempt organizations, they don't want them being involved in politics, and pastors shouldn't endorse from the pulpit. Well, guess what? I have news for you. The reason why that was done in the 1950s was done by Lyndon Johnson to silence the black churches, okay, during the times of segregation. So one, I'm an absolutist when it comes to First Amendment. If my pastor wants to endorse from the pulpit, he should be able to. Not that I would agree with it, maybe what he's doing, but I think he has every right to do it. And they've been deliberately using this law to prevent ministers from being able to, or ministries to be able to do that. The second thing is the prohibition on using state funding for religious schools was done deliberately by the Protestant-controlled government because of their anti-Catholicism. They didn't want Catholic schools getting money. So the two biggest restrictions that were done on churches were done out of intolerance and bigotry, to silence the black church, and then to silence and also to not support the Catholic schools. So I think when we start thinking of these restrictions that are done on religion, many of that are still in practice today, we recognize that it was done in intolerance and bigotry. That's what the basis is for this. So, and keeping in mind, the black church is an important voice, and I feel like that was done to silence them. And so for those of you who are in favor of these restrictions, just remember that these things were done in an intolerant way. So that I'm stepping off my soapbox now, but I just wanted to kind of frame it, that we have made a deal. We have a compact with the people and the states that churches are going to be given special privileges over and above anybody else in many ways. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Luke, welcome. Do you want to just say hi to everybody and quickly introduce yourself?
Hey. Yes, I'm Luke Hanson. If people have seen me, they have probably seen me on Ward Radio. I think I've done 2 or so Thoughtful Faith episodes as well. But I actually interviewed he wasn't a city planner, but he had done training and worked in the city around kind of that city planner role about the Fairview Temple. So I have some knowledge on it. Unfortunately, I had an important dinner appointment come up right when this was going to happen, after I scheduled with you guys. So I can only be here for a little bit before I gotta join them there. But
that's fine. We'll let you share.
So I don't know if you want me to talk right now and then kind of peace out, or if someone wanted to finish saying something first.
Well, yeah,
whatever you want to do.
Because I think the meat of the crux of this discussion really comes down to, does the town of Fairview, do they have a compelling interest, or basically reason legally, and we can get into the ethics after, but legally to say no to the church building a temple at 158 feet? And is the church is there a substantial burden to their free exercise of religion? Does it hinder temple worship by them decreasing the size to 68 feet and trying to adhere to the zoning regulations? I think that's where the crux of the discussion. So Jacob or Luke, whoever would like to go next. Luke, if you are limited with time, you can just sort of share your take.
Unfortunately, I might just have to say my thing and then peace out of here and watch it later to see what all you guys said. But Yeah, so in terms of Fairview, the thing, like when I talked to the city planner, he says there is no such thing as religious building zoning. So anytime you have a religious building that is going to be built somewhere, you always have to apply for a variance, I think is what he called it.
Right. Conditional.
And so it's not, yeah, it's not like the church is coming in and trying to get an exception that all the other churches, they have to follow these rules, and then the church is saying, no, we don't have to follow these rules. It's just the church is doing the normal process if you always apply for a variance, because there is no such thing as religious building zoning. And so the 30 feet that people talk about as being like the zoning code, and I'm just relaying what this guy told me. So if you wanna burn me, I like get technical, I'm just relaying what he said, and he knows his stuff. That 30 feet doesn't even really apply in this situation.
Yeah, that's correct.
That 30 feet limit, because you have to get a variance anyway. So I don't know if other people have said that already, but I just want to put that out there. And then in terms of if the church is right, if Fairview's right, look, I think that in a democracy, in a democratic situation, people have a right to advocate for their own interests and kind of duke it out. And so the church suing people or Fairview getting mad at the church, and that, to me, that's just kind of democracy happening. And so I think just like let the process happen. The church is following the rules, and in terms of like the council made a decision, they're allowed to sue them back, so they're suing them back, and judges will decide things, and so it's all playing out. I'm just a little confused why some guy over in the UK is getting so deeply involved and concerned about a suburb in Texas and their zoning their zoning laws, and making flights out there to talk about it and complain about it. And it just kind of, because some of these people, not everybody, but some people make an entire living off of criticizing the church. And their case is that the church is a big evil corporation that had terrible beginnings and now gets involved in sex scandals all the time. If there is a 17 million member church that's covering up serious crimes constantly, I feel like we should be hearing about those a little more. The fact that you're focusing on how tall a building is in a suburb of a town, honestly, you probably wouldn't like. Lots of people who are critics of the church are very progressive, and Fairview is a rich, white, Republican suburb in Texas. So like, you don't care about these people in any other situation, but then I guess you just like ran out of sex scandals to talk about. So now we got to talk about how they're trying to build a big, beautiful building that's too high. And just to be clear, I would be completely fine in my town if someone wanted to stick a huge, awesome mosque next to my house. I mean, if I'm not living next to other houses already, if there's an empty field next to me where I'm living, I'd be fine with that. So it's not like the hypocrite thing of my church needs to do it and everybody else. It's like, no, bring it all in. Like, what problem do we have with big, beautiful buildings? I know Steven wants to say stuff. I do have to go now, because I have
Luke, before you go, I actually wanted to specifically ask you a question, because you and I both have political backgrounds. And one of the things that I really don't get is the church, has resources, has PR people, has lobbyists. How does this happen where they get not a single council person to get to vote in favor of them? Like, for me, I'm reminded when they were able to close down that street in Kirtland, Ohio, they brought freaking Steve Young there. We talk about that in my episode. They brought the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers into town, and they did it. They know how to do politics. Why do you suppose they couldn't even get one member of the town council to vote for them? That just seems like they didn't do their due diligence. What do you think about that?
The city planner guy that I talked to kind of had the same thing of like it. And when we say the church, we're talking about whoever in the church office building was assigned to this specific case. It's not like President Nelson was there like, we're going to make it 170 feet high when we're saying the church. But yeah, I'm completely
would be aware and certainly overseeing what's going on. They wouldn't be, the church and its representatives wouldn't be acting without his awareness or direction or approval.
But it would be like a very slight awareness, direction, and approval. 17 million member church, he's handling BYU, Hawaii, BYU, Idaho. The guy's 98. Wait, no, he's 99, almost 100. They're building 30, 40 temples all at the same time. And so when we're talking about the height of the temple, one of like the 50, 60, 70 temples that they're trying to build right now, I think people want, if they have an agenda with the church, they want to try to attribute a lot more involvement to Nelson in the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 than is likely actually what happened. But to go back to your point, I am completely fine with saying, yeah, maybe the church shouldn't be, but if you're trying to turn this into like, and therefore the church is a big, huge, bad, evil empire corporation type of thing, it's like, no, corporations actually do stupid things all the time. The most reputable Johns Hopkins University, St. Jude's Hospital, like, I'm sure they all do missteps, PR missteps too. And so the church doesn't handle one temple exactly the way that they should have handled it. It's kind of like, yeah, we're human. I mean, sorry if you can't handle that we're human, but we are. So I don't know. I don't know what to tell you then. So that's my piece.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
Thanks. I think my quick response to that, my understanding of that, this is in my country, so I'm not expert in this, but my understanding is, yes, there is the CUP that they apply for, which is kind of like an exemption, but it still has to be approved by the zoning and planning and the town council. So I know in McKinley that the Islamic Association applied for a mosque, and it was shorter. I think it was 40 feet tall, about 30,000 square feet, and it got declined. So I don't think that churches can just go in to a local town and just say, well, your zoning ordinances, we can just build whatever size we want. I think there can be exemptions to them, but it still does have to be approved. Now, my understanding is, I think the church and its lawyers saw a bit of wiggle room in Fairview, Texas, that they could maybe push for a larger size, because what the lawyers seem to argue to me is that there was no criteria for how tall the religious building could be in Fairview. They're going to judge it based on the effects on the community, the aesthetics, and he was saying that those things were quite subjective. But it seems in other towns that they can also manage how tall a building can be a religious building. So even though it's a conditional use, it doesn't mean it can be whatever size you want. And town councils also have to make a decision based upon like the residents in the town as well, the general zoning, how it will look in the community.
Yeah, I like to weave in Steve's comment with kind of reaction to town versus how much you can regulate for religious buildings. So Steve's point where religious buildings get preferential treatment in the church, in the RLUIPA statement, did make that point that churches should receive preferential treatment. And Fairview has, in my opinion, and I'll share I have a grid of a Fairview City memorandum. So the residential zone limit is 35 feet. And with all the churches that applied for CUPs in that area did receive an exemption to go beyond it. And so...
yeah, that's normal for churches to go above the 35 feet.
Yeah, that's correct. And I know people pointing out the bell tower and the Creekwood bell tower, it was approved with conditions at 154 feet, but then they didn't meet those conditions and had to be redesigned to 51 feet. And they're just claiming that the bell tower is a precedent where they can actually build up to the 173 feet because of the 154-foot approval. But that's not a valid precedent because that was never built. It was actually built at 51 feet. So in my opinion,
a tower could be different to a building as well. And just to let people know that the 68 feet temple that they're proposing, that the town is offering you can have in the residential area, that would still be the joint largest building in the town. So it's not like they have a 150-foot size other building and they're like deliberately individually saying to the church, no, you can't have it as well. It would be the biggest building in the residential zone.
Right. In fact, the LDS Church does have the largest building in the residential zone, which is the stake center.
Right.
And so if on one hand, if City of Fairview accepts the LDS chapel at the temple at 173 feet, they'll be discriminating against the Methodist Church because they rejected their 154 feet. And so for the city of Fairview to be consistent with all the religions in the area, they have to keep the temple at 68 feet. Otherwise, they'll be favoring one religion over the other. And I think that's wrong.
It's a good point. Actually, I didn't actually think about that. Any responses to that before, Jacob, we dive into your sort of main statement?
I guess I'll just hop in real quick. Mainly because since I'm not very familiar with all the laws, I'll share what I noticed from what I've seen and read, and maybe you guys can hop in and just complement that. But as I was reading, Jacob, the document you sent us, I wasn't able to finish it all, but by what I was reading, I was also trying to see attorney's opinion on, well, the RLUIPA, sorry, RLUIPA, I think it's called.
That's what I called in the last episode, Dua Lipa.
Dua Lipa.
And to what it applies to and what it doesn't. I think that the church, for the most part, during that document, is sort of explaining the purpose of the temple, at least what I read. And during the video, they're explaining whether under the RLUIPA, churches are exempt from zoning laws and things like that. And the attorney expressed that they still have to sort of adequate to those restrictions, but that the government doesn't need to impose them unless there is some sort of restriction or danger. And some of the things that I saw were mentioned were like traffic. I think that's one of the reasons why the church mentioned that in the article, that traffic won't really be a problem, maybe because they had in mind that that might be a concern. And for the most part, I read about half the document. I saw that the church is sort of pleading the case why they can build a temple. And from what I noticed, what you mentioned, Murph, maybe the issue is not the temple itself, or at least I haven't seen people really speaking out against the temple or against the staple. I guess it was just a height problem. I found a website from the Fairview neighborhood, and they were sort of trying to push back against the height of the temple. And for example, the reasoning they gave on that website is that if they do the exception, they would have to apply it for all, and maybe that would really destroy the community. Now, as to whether I agree to that or not, I think that I think it can be a slippery slope. I don't think that if this is approved, then everyone will try to see who can make the tallest building and ruin the community. I don't think that will happen. But my main concerns or issues maybe are more on how how this all unraveled. On the legal side, from what I can see, is that the church can ask the exception, and they have the right to do that. So I have to agree with that on the legal side. So those are my quick 2 cents. I guess, Jacob, you can complement that, and then we will move on to maybe the execution. I'll share a bit more of my thoughts.
Okay, Jacob, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so I love what Steven said, Steven Pynakker, because it has a lot to do with what I'm about to say. I want to build off of it because he spoke a lot about the general principles of what I'm going to say. And so I'm going to go into the weeds about the case law, because I feel like the panel and Nemo, I think they spread a lot of misinformation about the church's intentions and about the legal aspects of this, because they're making it sound like the city of Fairview isn't placing a substantial burden on the church. As long as they're not placing a substantial burden on the ordinances themselves, then it doesn't count. But according to Texas state law and RLUIPA, and according to case law from the Massachusetts Supreme Court, that's just not true. So I'll go into my my statement. So first, I want to address Nemo's 3 points he made in his speech at the town council. I'm going to address number 1 and 3 because they are interrelated. I think they misrepresent the church's position and they are irrelevant legally. Number 1, temples do not need steeples. Number 2, steeples do not need to be a certain height. Number 3, architecture is secondary to the ordinances that happen inside. So let's address number 1, temples do not need steeples. Nemo and the rest of the panel claim that the church is dishonest when they tell their members around Fairview to emphasize the importance of steeples in the town meeting. He then cites President Nelson and Elder Bednar as examples when they say something to the effect that the architecture doesn't matter and shouldn't affect the personal experience of faithful members when they attend the temple. I agree with this. Whether the temple has a steeple or not, an endowment is an endowment, an initiatory is an initiatory, and a baptism is a baptism. However, Nemo compares apples and oranges here, because when it comes to the Fairview case, the church isn't referring to how the architecture affects faithful members' personal experiences when they attend the temple. They're referring to the message the architecture sends to the world and to heaven. For example, here is the message the local leaders sent to the members that ex-Mormons on Reddit are freaking out about. This is what they told members to say when they went to the town council. Quote, "The height of the steeple is part of our religious observance. The steeple is the temple's most distinctive architectural feature and serves no other purpose than to send a religious message. Steeples point toward heaven and serve a purpose of lifting our eyes and thoughts towards heaven. The steeple expresses a message of faith and devotion to God. You don't need to use these exact words. In fact, it's probably best if we don't. Use your own," close quote.
I pause for a second, just interject. It seems to me, if I'm translating that, the church is saying, and whenever I read through the document, that, because the panel, Nemo argued that our steeples aren't essential part of temples. There's a few temples that don't have them. The height of the steeple isn't an essential part of temple worship. It's not about the size or the design or the architecture, that impacts the temple ordinance and it functioning as the house of the Lord. But I think what the church is arguing, that it doesn't matter whether or not it's essential or not under our doctrine. They're kind of saying that any exercise of religion, whether it's if it's religiously motivated, then it is protected under religious freedom. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, the church is saying, it's not on par with the ordinances, but it's important enough to still to fall under the religious protections of RLUIPA and state law.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're saying. Correct.
Okay.
So Nemo, Landon, and Rebecca were making it sound like the church was trying to argue that a steeple is just as important as the ordinances that happen inside the temple. And that isn't what the church is arguing at all. All they are arguing is that the steeple is generally important because of the message it sends to heaven and to the world. They are also making a legal argument that while the steeple does not have the same level of religious significance as the ordinances, it is still important enough to fall within the protection of state and federal law. Second, Nemo seems to be insinuating that the church is somehow trying to hide the fact that they have temples without steeples to bolster their argument that the Fairview Temple needs to have a steeple. But this is belied by the legal document they sent to the Fairview Town Council and the speech given by Mr. Abernathy. They're very transparent about the fact that they have 5 temples that don't have steeples, and they explained why on page 22 of the document. These temples are exceptions that prove the rule. The church has consistently shown that they try very hard to put a steeple on the vast majority of their temples. In the case of the Meridian, Idaho, and Tucson Temple, they both have structures on the top of the temples that fulfill the same function as a steeple. 3 of the temples that don't have steeples were built in the early 1900s when the church was very poor, and the steeple would have added more of a financial burden. All that's left is the France Temple, and in that case, the church had no choice because France is an extremely secular country, almost to a fault, with an extremely centralized and bureaucratic government with no equivalent to RLUIPA. The church chose not to fight that fight. That doesn't mean they wouldn't have chosen a steeple if they had the choice. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the France Temple one day ends up having a steeple, much like the Boston Temple did. When it comes to Nemo's third point, architecture is secondary to the ordinances that happen inside. The church has never denied this point. They've only argued that it's irrelevant legally when it comes to whether a steeple should fall under the protection of RLUIPA and other state laws. This makes Nemo's third point a straw man. In the legal document they sent to Fairview, the church bolstered this argument by citing their experience with the Boston Temple. The steeple for that temple was rejected initially by the city of Boston, and the lower courts also rejected the church's attempt to appeal that decision because they believed that a steeple was not necessary to the temple's religious purpose. However, the Massachusetts Supreme Court rejected the lower court's conclusion, and in their decision, they said, quote, "It is not for the judges to determine whether the inclusion of a particular architectural feature is necessary for a particular religion. The record is replete with evidence that the steeple is integral to the specific character of the contemplated use. There was uncontradicted testimony that the church values an ascendancy of space for the religious ceremonies performed in temples." You can also read page 22 and 23 of the Fairview legal document, where the church cites other relevant case law stating that it is not the role of the courts to quote, "determine what is or is not a matter of religious doctrine," and that courts lack, quote, "any license to decide the relative value of a particular exercise of religion."
I apologize.
Notice.
Sorry. So yeah, basically what you're saying is that steeples, they're a religious symbol, which are an important part of the architecture of a building, and it's not for the town council or for a court to say whether or not it is essential or not. If it's religiously motivated, then they're entitled to have it. I think the response that the last panel would give, or maybe the Fairview residents, is they would say, and the town council, we're not saying no to a steeple. You can have a steeple, you can have that religious symbol. They're basically saying that it's a zoning issue, and this is the size of the temple that you can have in our town, 68 feet. You can have a temple, it just needs to be reduced in size. So they're not saying, well, you don't have to have a steeple, it's not an essential part, so you can't have it. No, the town is saying that you can have a steeple, it just needs to fit within the zoning regulations.
I get that, but if Nemo had just stuck with his second point, I wouldn't be making this statement. But he made his first and third point saying that the church doesn't need a steeple at all. And in that point, he's wrong. He oversold his argument.
I think he addressed that in our video. I think he said when he went to the council meeting and he made that speech. Is that what you're responding to?
Correct. And
right.
I know I watched the video twice, and I know that he says that he addressed that, but I don't think he did.
Well, I think his argument was, if I'm remembering right, is he said he wasn't speaking to the law. He was just speaking to our church doctrine. So if some Latter-day Saints were going and saying that it's an essential part of our religious worship and doctrine, he was just saying, oh, well, it's not essential. But if they're arguing legally that, oh, well, it can be part of our religious worship, it's a preferable part, like religious symbol, then that's fair enough.
Well, he says that, but he's addressing a political body, and what he says has legal implications no matter what his intentions are. And so what he's addressing a town council, and he's trying to persuade them to make a certain decision. So it has legal implications. So, I mean, if that's not his intention to make a legal argument, then what is his intention? To grandstand or make the church look bad? That it just confuses me as to what his intention is if it's not to make a legal argument.
I think if I'm representing Nemo, and maybe I'm doing a little bit of mind reading here, I think that letters were sent out to sort of like the local wards and members, pretty much telling them to advocate at that town council meeting that a steeple is an essential part of our religious worship. And I think he was going there to say it's not essential part. I think that's what he was doing.
Yeah, the church is sending out that letter because they're making a legal argument, and they're convincing the members to also make that legal argument. In this context, they're making a legal argument. And in the context
can I help in real quick?
Yeah.
All right, so sorry. It's just that when it comes to, well, in this case, what Nemo said and what the church members were invited to say, I think they weren't really addressing. I mean, Spencer, you listened to the recordings. I think you can compliment on this. But I don't remember them really addressing the height issue. I think the members were advocating for the steeple, And for example, what Nemo said, he was saying cases in which it's not there or that the height is not important. I heard that another member made that case. And I think that by addressing whether or not a staple should be there, I don't remember anyone except a lawyer, maybe with the bell tower, addressing the height. I think that was maybe a reason why there are, I find no like real arguments for the height, because I hear people either in favor of the staple or against the staple, but I don't think the height is really addressed that much.
And the
Yeah,
height seems to be
I
the
think
crux
the
of the
whole-
issue for Fairview. Sorry, Jacob.
Yeah, well, the
because-
thing is if the focus was only on the height, like I would get it. Like the church is kind of pushing the envelope here. They're like the church does kind of have a case because it's related to the architecture, and they can use what the Massachusetts Supreme Court said to say that, you know, the political bodies can't decide what is and isn't important to a religion, and they can relate that to the height of the steeple as well as to the steeple. But I get that what Nemo's saying, that like their church is kind of pushing its luck with the height, but he's just
Right.
flat out wrong if he's saying that the steeple is not important to like our worship because the Massachusetts Supreme Court disagrees with him. And he can say he's not trying to make a legal argument, but in this context, everything is a legal argument, whether he likes that or not, because we're trying to convince a political body to side with us. And so everything is a legal argument in this context.
Sure. And the town is saying that they can have a steeple. So I think that the steeple, getting caught up in the steeple, is a little bit of a red herring. The issue, it seems, from the town is they're fine with the church having a temple and having a steeple. It just needs to reduce in size to 68 feet. They're not saying that, oh, well, you can't have a steeple, it's not essential to your worship. Even if it's not essential, if the church says it's an important part of our religious worship, an important architectural symbol, the town's like, fine, just reduce the size. So it's more of like a height issue than I think steeple. But anyway, continue.
But if Nemo can convince people that that the steeple itself isn't necessary, then he can make the church's argument look even more ridiculous, even more like outlandish. Whereas if people understand that the steeple falls under the religious protection of RLUIPA, then it makes their argument look a lot more reasonable. That, well, if the steeple can fall under the protection, then does the height of the steeple also fall under the religious protection? Like that's kind of what I'm trying to get here. Is if we know what the true, like if we can dispel the misinformation here, then it makes the church's argument look at least a little more reasonable. And it makes them look more honest and not as nefarious as Nemo is trying to paint it as. And that's what I'm trying to accomplish here. I understand if he had just stuck with that second point, then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
And I'll just make one quick point before you go ahead. Sorry, I'm interjecting a lot.
That's fine.
If the town said no to a steeple, you can only have a 42-foot temple, but no steeple. I think that would be going against their freedom to exercise religion under RLUIPA. I think it's more of a gray area because the town is saying you can have the steeple and the temple, it just needs to be this size, fitting in with our zoning codes. And I think that's more the crux. And I know you're responding and addressing Nemo and the statement he gave at the town council.
And I'm speculating here, but I think the church is actually trying to test the limits of RLUIPA and seeing whether not only does the steeple fall under, but does the height fall under the protection of RLUIPA. I think they're trying to test the limits to see, does it fall under? And to add something here, this isn't just like the church versus Fairview. Like, for example, when the church won that case in Massachusetts, that set a precedent that other religions within Massachusetts could use, where if, like, say, a Muslim like mosque is trying to build a mosque in Massachusetts, and someone says, no, not in my town, you're not going to build a mosque, they can point to that case law in Massachusetts and say, are you sure you want to mess with us? Because the Mormons were able to win over a steeple, and our case is a lot more clear cut than just a steeple. And so other religions can use that case law as a way to protect themselves from having their rights infringed upon. And so what the church is doing here has a lot more implications than just for themselves. If they win this case in court in Texas as well, it can clear the playing field for other religions too. And like that the Muslims in McKinney as well. If the church wins this case in Texas, they can point to that case law in Texas and say, are you sure you want to mess with us? Because the Mormons were able to win this case over the height of a steeple. And our case is a lot more clear cut than just the height of a steeple. And so it's a lot more than just a steeple. It has a lot more implications than just that. I just want to make that point.
Okay.
I have a counter argument to your overall point. So Massachusetts Supreme Court governs Massachusetts, not the 5th District, not the 5th Circuit, which covers Texas. Cody Reddish, she's a lawyer, audio lawyer that went on Mormonish, pointed out a 5th Circuit case law, a specific case, this very language about substantial burden, and that's the core of the case. By Fairview restricting the size of the temple, will that impose a substantial burden on the church is the main question. The 5th Circuit defined substantial burden as thus, that truly pressures the adherent to significantly modify its religious behavior. 2, significantly violates its religious beliefs. Now, I do find the church being disingenuous with the height of the temple being a core religious belief. The core religious belief, the behavior, is the ordinance itself. Within the ordinance, there's no mention of the height of the temple within the ordinance. It's not a covenant. It's not in the language of the ordinance. And so, regardless of the size of the temple, I don't see it being a substantial burden because we can practice those ordinances in temples of various sizes. Since the mid-90s, President Hinckley instituted the small temple program. So that's why I find the church's position to be disingenuous.
In response to that, I guess I
do.
Go ahead.
The Massachusetts Supreme Court doesn't govern Texas, but they still have to take RLUIPA into account when they make their decisions. And so the Massachusetts Supreme Court and the 5th Circuit Court, they're both taking RLUIPA into account when they make their decisions. And so they may come to different decisions, who knows, but they're both being governed by the same federal law. So just throwing that out there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're arguing different jurisdictions. It's the Supreme Court that will take differences between the Massachusetts versus the 5th District. So the Massachusetts doctrine doesn't apply to the 5th Circuit in the 5th Circuit case.
Not directly, but they're still both governed by the federal law regarding to RLUIPA. That's what I'm saying. They both have to take that federal statute into account. At least that's the way I understand it.
Now, the RLUIPA, there are 5 basic protections. 1, protection against unequal treatment. 2, protection against religious denominational discrimination. 3, protection against local exclusion of religious assemblies. And lastly, protection against unreasonable limitation of religious assemblies. It doesn't include Massachusetts case law within RLUIPA, so that's why it doesn't apply to the 5th Circuit.
Okay, yeah, we'll see. I'm just throwing that out there.
Gustavo, I know you and Spencer might have to go pretty soon. I wouldn't mind keeping going maybe with the discussion a little bit more, but if you have to go, do you want to sort of share your final thoughts and kind of final take on this?
In
terms of like
conversation, I could say longer, so I'll defer to Gustavo.
Yeah.
All right. So basically, the main issue, like I said, with this whole Fairview thing, is not really about what's legal or what's not. I've been getting more familiar with that. I've learned new things. But in regards to this, I guess the only issue I have is how it's been executed, because of the way that um, lawyers have told stake presidents what the focus should be and things like that. I think that members of the church, regardless of whether that was the intention of the first presidency or not, I think that can be called into question. But I think the members of the church, and I think overall religious people, at least the people I know, can very quickly turn this into a victim complex and start addressing that instead of the technical things themselves. And for example, by watching the panel, as I scroll through the comments, many of them were like, "Oh, just a bunch of antis," and one of them's one of the usernames was anti-Mormons are idiots, and it was like, was that necessary?
Yeah, some people
And
call Nemo a liar and just saying the church is being persecuted. And
yeah, and so I'm not sure what the interactions like outside the city hall look like between members and non-members in Texas. But I I see that it very quickly turned into a fight. I think that it could have been easily kept as a legal thing, as something that needed to be addressed. But I think what really exploded was the attitude the members took. I know that Mormonish and Emo or the previous panel share the idea that it wasn't them, like they were instructed to take this attitude. And some people say, no, they just needed to focus on the spirituality. And if they get out of hand, then that's their choice. But I think that's what's failing about this. The fact that as many members are saying like, yeah, like all of you guys hate Mormons and all of you guys are trying to control our religious freedom. And even if is validity to those arguments, I think that the confrontational approach was what hindered the relationships. That's my main concern. I think that in that case, the damage is already done. For people who have already been really rude, I think like we just have to accept the situation and move on with it. I think, I mean, in just my personal opinion, that I don't think the church should keep pushing for the height. I know they can. I know that's part of the religious freedom. But as I told Murph, I live here in Mexico. We have 14 temples. We have another 5 under construction. And I think the Fairview Temple in Texas is intended for about 16,000 people, if I'm not mistaken. And we have a new temple here in Puebla, and that's meant for around 50,000, like 3 times the amount of members. So I wanted to sort of compare the sizes of the temples. I can send it later in the chat, but the temple in Puebla is well, sort of small. It's like with the staple, it's like 100 feet. I know that that's taller from what Fairview is willing to allow the staple to be. But just as an example, uh, the walls and the height, I think that's within the limits. And I think that the Puebla temple addresses all the concerns raised in the document, that tall ceilings are important, especially for the celestial room, and how that helps us point ourselves towards heaven. And I see all of that in the Puebla, Mexico temple. And for that reason, it is hard for me to empathize with US temples that are way taller and bigger, and from what I see, to smaller congregations. So maybe that's my point of view as a Mexican, that I really don't see the need to push for that. I know that it can open new opportunities, test what can or can't be approved. But I guess my concluding thoughts would be that I think some sort of compromise needs to be done because of the negative impact. I know that the fact that some people go on YouTube and say the church sucks, the corporation sucks, I know that that doesn't help at all. But I think that the bad blood in Fairview, I think that the you'll thank me later approach is not working. I think that there should be more communication. I'm not too sure if they should just shorten the height and then just go with it. But I do think that based on my experience, the height won't change that much. And I think that just the approach between the inhabitants of Fairview should be more Christ-like. So I don't have a lot of issues with the legal thing. Yeah, I don't think the legal stuff are a big issue. I just think the way it's been approached, I think that's what would need to be better. But that's it.
All right. Thanks.
And I have, could I just say something to Spencer's point when he said that Massachusetts isn't relevant to Texas? Mr. Abernathy, the church's lawyer, he cited a Texas state law that the phrasing was extremely similar to the decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which said that it is not the decision of the judges or governing bodies to decide what is and isn't necessary to a church's architecture or beliefs. Or so, like, if the church were to go to the courts, I just speculation. I can't predict the future, but they'd probably decide the same thing. That's what he cited when he was responding to Nemo in his speech to the town council. And had something else, but it kind of slipped my mind. I'd like to point out that pretty much any criticism you can make towards the church, you can also make towards the town. You can say, well, it's just a steeple. You can say the same thing towards the town council. Why are you willing to bankrupt this town? Well, why are you willing to bankrupt your town? It really comes down to, do you value property rights of the church, or do you value the rights of the town to uphold their zoning laws? And another thing is that when I was listening to the panel, we see that they're like, well, the church needs to obey the zoning laws, but when they got to the point where they were willing to acknowledge the church may have a legal case here, it went from, well, the church needs to obey the 12th article of faith to, well, they may have a legal case. Well, if they do have a legal case, then the 12th article of faith is no longer relevant here. So if what the church is doing is legal, then I don't want to hear anything else about the 12th article of faith. You might be able to make a case with the 13th article of faith. If there's anything lovely, good, or praiseworthy, you need to lay out your argument, but I don't want to hear anything else about the 12th article of faith if what the church is doing is legal.
Okay, I kind of want to make a bit of a point. I have like a couple of points. I'm going to kind of make one point now, because this is what I'm thinking about. So the church, they're applying for the temple, and they've now brought down to 158 feet. 65 feet tall temple is what they want. So that is what, 90 something, whatever feet steeple. And the town has said that's too big for our zone. You can have 68 feet with a 42 feet tall temple, 26 feet tall steeple. So they're granting the steeple. And the church then can go and appeal to RLUIPA, saying that that is basically infringing or creating a burden in our freedom to worship. But my thought is reducing the size of a temple, keeping the steeple, but reducing it to 68 feet, does that really cause even a burden, but a substantial burden on religious worship? Does it take anything away from the temple functioning as the house of the Lord? It can still have the steeple. It can still be this consecrated, dedicated building. Other temples like the Dallas temple or even the Paris temple, it's 42 feet size. It has comparable square footage, and it serves a population in Paris of nearly double the amount. So, and if the church has brought it down 15 feet, why couldn't they bring the height down 90 feet? I guess in my mind, I just don't see reducing the size of the temple to 68 feet to adhere to the zoning regulations and what the city council is saying. I feel like that is a temple that would still make the LDS community happy, still serve and function in the community, and fulfill the needs of the church and the temple ordinances. And it's one that the community could be happy about as well. I don't feel like it's either we have a choice between love God and love your neighbor. In this case, we're loving God, so we're choosing the temple. I feel like it could be both. I feel like a compromise, like you were saying, Gustavo, could happen, that the church can still have their temple, have their steeple. It can be large enough. Maybe they can make it wider. They could adapt it. And the town could also be happy as well. And it almost seems that the church is having the attitude of, if we can find this legal exemption or loophole, then we're going to take it. It supersedes your zoning laws. And almost like the feelings of the town, the residents, and their zoning codes, they're pretty much saying like they don't really matter. What's your guys' thoughts on that point? Is the church being unreasonable?
Well, the church has been willing to compromise in the past. This is really out of character for them. And so I don't know what their intentions are, but they must have a really good reason for it. I don't know what it is. But for the past few decades, they've been willing to compromise with the towns. And so my answer to that is, to everything there is a season and a time for everything. Like that's what it says in the book of Ecclesiastes, and there's a time to compromise, and they've been compromising for decades. And I think that they see a moment here where there's just a time where you need to push back. And for whatever reason, they see that this is the time. And it's only relatively recently that they've been doing this with the Heber temple, with Cody, Wyoming, and with this temple. All the other temples decades back, they haven't done that. And so they have a reason for it. I don't know what it is.
I think, I would say that if we look at the Supreme Court decision, look at the makeup of the Supreme Court, it's 6-3 conservative. I think that the church probably legally and just strategically knows that they have a court that's probably going to be very sympathetic to them. And so the past, they probably compromised because they didn't have a Supreme Court that would have been in favor of it. So I think the shifting of the court to a more conservative, pro-religious, First Amendment view is probably one of the impetuses for why they're being a little more aggressive on this case too.
I mean, maybe, but there haven't been any land use cases that have made it to the Supreme Court yet. There have been plenty of inmates' rights cases that have made it, but there haven't been any land use cases that have made it. When I was reading the document I shared with you guys, they've all been decided.
They think this is the chance to expand more religious freedom. And I think that most of your evangelical churches and your Roman Catholic Church and all the other groups will probably be in favor of helping out in amicus briefs and everything like this. So this could be new territory of trying to expand religious rights in our country, and I think that might be part of it. So I think including the Satanic Temple can benefit from this as well. Isn't that it's a win-win, if you will, for everybody?
Yeah, that's what I said earlier. It's much more than about a steeple. It could help expand the rights of other religions, including Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists. Yep. They can point to that. If the church wins this case, they can point to that case and say, you really want to mess with us? Because the Mormons were able to win this case, and so you don't want to mess with us because they were able to win over a steeple. So that's my point. I think that this could really be beneficial for religious freedom.
I do the answer to your question. It's from the church's RLUIPA statement, and I'll read a couple paragraphs from it. It says, in sum, temples are the house of the Lord. Temple design and location determined by the first presidency of the church under the direction of the Lord. Their design not only accommodates religious worship, but it is self and active worship. Attempts by government officials to dictate temple location and design would interfere with their church's cherished beliefs. This is the very essence of substantial burden. In short, a church never holds the trump card. The municipality always holds it because no matter how sincere or important the affected religious exercise is, can be restricted or even prohibited if the municipality has a compelling interest and pursues that interest to the nearest possible means. A compelling interest is an interest of the highest order, generally requires some substantial threat to public safety, peace, or order. I think the reason why they're moving now is they don't want to be restricted by local officials. And the reason why, and Steve kind of pointed at the beginning, the Pound of Fairview, they want to keep it country. And so that was their value. And for them to adhere to that value, they wanted to restrict buildings within a residential zone to 35 feet because they want to keep buildings small. And they did grant exemptions to religious buildings to a certain point. And from their view, and the representatives' view, they're protecting their town's values of keeping the country by voting 5-0 to Steve's point, and of why they voted 5-0 nothing for their church. And I think part of it was the church's lawyer threatening lawsuits or threatening to send a case to DOJ. It was local officials saying, if you don't like the temple, the big temple, move out. We'll gladly buy your home. It was the thousands of emails flooding the cities that cities are reading the emails. They felt they were under attack. So that's why they voted 5-0. And it's that question of what is the authority of a municipality and its values versus religious freedom, I think is really the main crux of the question.
Yeah, I remember listening to Flip, what do you call the lawyer who was on Mormonish? Colby Reddish?
It was Cody Reddish.
Yeah, so obviously I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about federal laws, but I was listening to him and he was basically saying if this went to federal court, like the Supreme Court, it's a bit ambiguous what would be the outcome, what would happen. He said that the town would have to have a compelling interest or reason to reject the church's proposal if they, were appealing to RLUIPA, which he said include like safety, impact to peace or public order. Suppose you could say there might be an uproar in the town, but I don't think there's any safety issues from the temple. So he's saying that the town may not have a strong, compelling interest to reject, but he also said equally the town rejecting the proposal and saying 68 feet. He says the church has to also argue why that is a substantial burden that we kind of touched on. I sort of articulate why I don't think it's a substantial burden. I think there could be adjustments and modifications, but the church would need to show legally why it is a substantial burden and why they couldn't accommodate and adjust and why it couldn't function the same at that height. I also want to just contrast what I've seen in the mosque in McKinney and their behavior and what the church has done in Paris with their temple. So one of the council members in McKinney, I don't remember if he was mayor on the council, but he's basically advocating, he's a member of the church, for the size of the temple in Fairview. But then on the McKinney Town Council, they've rejected an Islamic mosque, which is 40 feet tall, so it's smaller than the temple, nearly 4 times smaller than the proposed temple, 33,000 square foot in the residential area of town, I believe. And the reaction of the Islamic Association, I think they're a bit disappointed, but they said that we want to respect the feelings of the residents and we will adjust our plans to fit with the town zoning codes, and we want to be good neighbors. And also, I have this quote from Elder Cosse. This is about the Paris Temple, which is 42 feet tall with no steeple. And he said that there are a number of constraints that we have, the code that we have to respect, but in the end, it is only good because it makes for a temple that everybody accepts and recognizes as theirs. And I guess my question is, I see the Islamic community respecting the zones and the codes in McKinney, rejecting their proposed mosque height, and I see the church in Paris working and following the zones and the constraints they had, respecting the code, the zoning laws and regulations, because they want everyone to accept it and they want everyone to be happy in the community. Are they doing that in Fairview? Are they building a temple that everyone would accept as their own, that would make both the LDS community and the Fairview community happy? Are they being good neighbors to the people of Fairview? To me, I don't think they are. What's people's responses to that? Why is it a different? Why are they behaving differently in Fairview? Is this fair to the people, the residents of Fairview, that potentially their town could face bankruptcy when we know the church can compromise and follow the coding zoning regulations and the codes at other times?
I think that's fair to ask that question, but it's almost somewhat irrelevant, like how the Muslims decided how they were going to do it and how they were going to respond. You got to keep in mind too that you live in a nation that's predominantly Christian, and you have a lot. You're in red country, and there's a lot of hostility towards Muslims, and so I can see how they would be more sheepish in not trying to be too aggressive because of the uncomfortable relationship that this country has with Islam, right? So I think they understood that they have their own self-interests there that they would do. So I don't think it's fair to say, well, that's how the Muslims did it, so that's how you should do it. Now, do I think that the church? I do feel like they did kind of fumble this whole thing. And again, I think they're capable of doing compromise. They're also capable of lobbying, doing politics, and I think they did kind of blow it. They caused the hostility from the town council. I just don't think there's any doubt in that mind, because again, it boggles my mind that they couldn't even, that they know how to do this. They're good at lobbying. They're good at this in the state of Utah and all this kind of stuff. And that they kind of, I feel like they dropped the ball. But I also look at France. France is an aggressively anti-religious secular society. They do not have a First Amendment like we do. And if you look in the French-speaking world, this is in both France and Quebec, they have very aggressively anti-religious views, or the ability of people to even wear religious garb outside, or state employees wearing crosses. So they are aggressively anti-religious in one sense, and I don't want us to follow that lead. We're a product of the American Revolution, not the French Revolution. So the church has to work each country differently. But I also think that when we look at it, because we have a strong view of the First Amendment in this country, that we have religious freedom, and if you have the ability as an organization, as a church, to be able to continue expanding these freedoms as opposed to having them shrunk down, I think they probably see it this is a strategic thing to actually expand religious freedom rights. So I think that's what's happening. Now, could they have done better PR? Could they have been maybe better neighbors? Oh, yes, of course. And the Muslims, they made a choice to how they're going to conduct themselves. That's for them. That's what they decided to do. But if they win this case, guess what? The Muslims will have the opportunity then to maybe be able to eventually do open up that mosque. So then it actually helps with helping the Muslim situation too. So that's just how I see it.
Any quick responses, Steve?
I'm open to admitting that when it comes to tact, that they didn't handle the situation the best. I just wanted to, my main shtick here was just addressing the misinformation spread by Nemo and the panel, and addressing the legal issues. I think that maybe the members in Fairview could have done a better job. The local leaders could have done a better job at being good neighbors. However, I do think that the church does have a chance here when it comes to the legal aspects to open up avenues when it comes to religious freedom in the United States, in Texas. So it's kind of I don't know, bad things in some areas and good things in others.
It's no different than activists. It's no different than the LGBTQ activists suing to expand their rights. Like, that's just something that we do in this country. Like, if you have an opportunity to set a precedent to expand more freedom for people, different civil rights organizations do that. This is just part of the American system. If you think you have the opportunity to expand the rights of religion in your religious body, you go for it. Just makes sense to me.
Just one thought that I have. I wish that some of these zoning ordinances, I don't know if this is the same for every town, so that churches that obviously they apply for a CUP, so they don't have to adhere to the strict residential zoning. But I feel like it would be so much easier and clearer. I think the point I was making was, why isn't there like a height restriction for religious buildings in different towns under their zoning regulation? Because it would be a bit ridiculous if a certain religion wanted to build like a 600-foot tall building in, like, say, a really small country town. And at that point, we say, okay, well, how fair is that on this little country town? They just want to live in a quiet rural environment, enjoy their nice views, and there's a massive building. Do you know what I mean? Like, and it feels like if this is allowed by the church, where's the line to how far it could be taken?
I was not actually thinking about that as you said it. I think each municipality, and Steve kind of made this point even on a country basis, that each city in the U.S. has their own different views and values and composition of people. And I think that local municipalities should have the flexibility and come up with their own values and what they want for their town. At the same time, have the obligation to, and the responsibility to protect religions and to grant them their exemptions beyond the residential limits so they can get the preferential treatment. It's going to look different from place to place. And I think the church needs to adjust. My concern is I don't see adjusting from them, because they're saying that this temple design, it's a revelation from God, so it can't be modified, the size, the architecture, whatever. And local leaders should not get in the way of telling us to modify our own building, because we're performing the work of the Lord and the salvation. I think that's what I'm worried about, is that tax is they won't be willing to adjust. And that's my biggest fear right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think my internet has stopped working, so I can't get my computer work. I think maybe we could just finish with just any final thoughts that everyone wants to share on just their view on what they think legally might happen, who they think do the federal laws on this, and RLUIPA, does it supersede the town civic laws and zoning, and then just your thought on both the legal and then the ethical. Would you like to start, Steve? Just sort of like your final thoughts?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Murph, for assembling this panel discussion today. I think it's good to hear all these different voices and have people have their say. I speak in favor of a very strong view of religious freedom in this country. This country was founded upon these values. I don't really like to compare even to Mexico, because Mexico for much of the 20th century was a secular socialist society. So there's an antagonism against religion in many ways that's built in there. And I don't want us to follow the lead of other countries that are more aggressively against religious freedom, because this country was founded upon that. That's why we flee to Europe to come here for freedom. And so I understand that maybe the church could have done things better with PR. I do think sometimes they do drop the ball now and then, and I sometimes think, wow, why do they do this? I don't get it. And I'm speaking as an outsider who has no animosity towards the church. I'm very much a friend in many ways to the people of the Restoration. So yeah, that's pretty much where I'm coming from. So thanks, Murph, for putting this together.
Awesome. Jacob, would you like to go next? Just share your final thoughts.
Yeah. As far as whether the church will win this case, I don't know. I just wanted to correct some misinformation. If it was just about whether the church should have a steeple, I think they would win. But since it's about the height of the steeple, I think that's an unprecedented case that the church is trying to test out. So
right.
I'm not sure. As far as the ethics go, because it's not just about the church against the city of Fairview, it's also about a broader religious freedom case that could impact other religions. I think we need to look at it in terms of that as well, and the effects it could have on religions that Rebecca, Landon, and Nemo really care about. I know they have a hard time finding sympathy in their heart for us and our church. They have a lot of animosity, at least towards the institution. But I asked them to consider the effects that this case could have upon the Muslims in McKinney and other religions that they see as more vulnerable. And as far as how the church could have handled from a PR standpoint as being good neighbors, sure, I can acknowledge that they could have done a better job. They probably should have done what they did in Boston, as far as trying to reach out and be good neighbors, and then slowly work their way up through the courts to get what they wanted, rather than just starting out with saying we're going to sue you. That's I think that's all I have to say.
Spencer?
Thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. From different perspectives, from Gustavo, from his experiences, and from our evangelical friend, learned a lot from him, and from Jacob and his perspective. I honestly think that Fairview's doing a good job on walking the hard rope. They're representing their interests in keeping the country. Same time, I think they are being fair with religions in their jurisdiction, keeping granting them exceptions and putting them about the same height, so they're not discriminating against any one denomination. And so I think the church has a significant hurdle in the Fifth Circuit. You have to show that that substantial burden. You have to show that restricting the size or truly modify the religious behavior and significantly violate their religious beliefs. And from a Latter-day Saint, perspective, I can't see how a smaller temple really modifies behavior or changes their beliefs.
Right. Gustavo, do you have anything you'd like to add, or have you shared your piece? Is he still here?
Yes.
Sorry, I can't see
still
it.
here. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Murph. As a non-American, I guess I can only speak from my experience. But I was asked once on this whole temple issue on whether I think that the church should dial down on temples or if the sky's the limit. They asked me that because they knew I didn't really like the approach towards the temple. And honestly, I do think that sky's the limit. As a member of the church, I'm very happy that we get them. We're getting just one in our city, in Toluca. And we're very excited for that. I love the temple. And I guess that I would still, I fail to see maybe what the benefits of them winning this case would be. I guess I would need to be more informed of that. Maybe that's why I have a harder time accepting or even agreeing to pushing on the height. But overall, I do hope the temple gets built. I do hope they get everything cleared out. And it was great talking to you, Murph, to you, Steve, and to get to know you, Jacob and Spencer. So once again, thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Gustavo. I think I'll just share like my wrapping up thoughts, and I still sort of hold a similar position that I think I did on the last panel. I appreciate you all coming on. I think it was good to have different points of view, to have more members on the panel as well. Like I'm really happy that the church is growing and building more temples. I think it's great there's more access to temples. I'm not being bitter because there's no temple in my country, and yeah, we'd be so happy to have a temple. I don't see this as the church has to have a 158 feet temple in a residential zone, and they'll lose if they drop to a 68 feet temple. I feel like it would impact the town, certainly as you talk about, Spencer, the country feel of the town, and impact the residents. I don't feel that it would be a substantial burden on them, their freedom to exercise religion, reducing the size of the temple and still being able to have a steeple. I think adjustments and accommodations could be made. I think a compromise could be had to satisfy both parties in the community. I just think the way it's being handled, even if the church wins the legal battle, which I don't know if it will, I think it's going to be a gray area. I think it will be interesting to see what would happen in federal court. But if we did get the large temple, I couldn't see really many Fairview residents being too happy or wanting to convert to the church. After that, it will leave a bad taste in the mouths. And I think I see other times where the churches try to work more with local towns and follow zoning. And I feel in this case that they could compromise. I don't think it would take away the significance of the temple or temple worship or have a big impact upon it. And I think that they
could compromise. I don't feel like it's really loving their neighbor. And even if they won the legal battle, for me, I still think the ethical war would be lost on it. And I wish it was handled differently, and a solution could be found. But that's my final piece. But guys, thank you all for coming on. I think it's been great to do this panel, and everyone to share their thoughts and perspectives. Go check out Steve's channel, Mormon Book Reviews, and the great stuff he puts out. Go check out Gustavo's channel. I struggle to say it, via Hess Stiffé. Is that right? And Jacob Mayberry, your channel, Actual Mormons, as well. And comment underneath your thoughts on this video as well. Any pushbacks, any things that we might have missed as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.